When most of us hear the name Carmine Galante, we can't help but think of the aftermath of what took place in 1979, as well as the photos of him sprawled out on the floor with his ever-present cigar clenched in his mouth. Putting those images aside, Galante lived an interesting life, one covered in many articles, books, and videos throughout the years. I like to go over his life to some extent, and doubt I'll be adding any new information that's not already known, but you never know. So with that said, join me for a trip back in history with the life of Carmine Galante. Camillo Carmine Galante was born on February 21st, 1910. His parents, Vincenzo and Vincenza, ironically named the male and female version of the same name, immigrated to the United States from Castellamare del Golfo in Sicily. Their second son, Camillo, was approximately 4 years old when they arrived in the United States, specifically East Harlem, New York. Despite the fact that during his youth, Galante held numerous legitimate jobs, but he, like most young Italians back then, became involved with gangs and the street life. And as early as age 10, he made several trips to reform school. According to reports, he had a desire to fight, even though he was shorter than most other kids. His arrest history dates back to 1925, at which time he dropped out of high school. In December of 1925, he was involved in an assault that got him a 2-year sentence. Prior to his arrest, he was employed at the Lubin Artificial Flower Company in New York City from 1923 to 1925. After an attempted robbery, he was released by a judge to the Catholic Society, which was common back then. Either a mother or both parents would plead to their local priest, asking them to go to the court and say that the church would take responsibility of the youthful offender, as opposed to going to prison. Records indicate he was also employed at O'Brien's Fish Company, where he worked as a fish sorter. On March 15, 1930, Galante and others was involved in a payroll robbery at the Martin Weinstein Shoe Company on York Street. During the robbery, police officer Walter D. Castiglia was shot twice and killed. Galante and his crew came away with no money after quickly leaving the scene in a getaway car and leaving behind $7,267. Galante would be arrested that August, but those charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. One of the guys that was involved in that robbery with him was his cousin, Angelo Presenzano. On December 24, 1930, Galante and others attempted to hijack a truck in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, but police officer Joseph Menahan spotted the crew in a green sedan. Impulsively, Galante and his friends responded with gunfire. Menahan was shot 5 times, but only received a leg injury, and one of the stray bullets accidentally hit a 6-year-old girl. Both the girl and Menahan survived their injuries. Although injured, Menahan managed to get hold of one of the fleeing suspects, which happened to be 20-year-old Carmine Galante. Consequently, on February 8, 1931, Galante was sentenced to 12.5 years following his guilty plea to attempted robbery. While incarcerated at Sing Sing prison, Galante was diagnosed by a prison doctor with having a psychopathic personality. He would be released in May 1939. Records indicate in February 1941, Galante became a member of the International Longshoremen's Association. He was also listed as working as a handyman for the General Electric Plating Company that same year. And in 1942, he was employed at the Knickerbocker Trucking Company as a helper. He was also said to have worked in a pastry shop. He would list himself as the owner of 2 businesses, the Rosalina Costume Company in Brooklyn and Abco Vending in New Jersey. While hiding in Italy to avoid prosecution, Vito Genovese became friendly with Benito Mussolini. At the time, Mussolini wanted a newspaper editor, Carlo Tresca, killed. Apparently, Tresca vocally criticized Mussolini, and because Tresca was living in the United States, he brought this problem to Genovese. So Genovese, wanting to do Mussolini a favor, put a contract out on Tresca. On the evening of January 11, 1943, Tresca and a friend headed out for dinner around 9:30 p.m. 2 hours earlier, Galante reported to his parole officer on 80 Center Street in Manhattan. After he left, he was tailed by another parole officer to see if he was consorting with known criminals, which he was prohibited from doing so. But somehow Galante managed to slip away from the parole officer's tail in a black Ford. As Tresca and his friend were walking down the street, a man in a brown coat appeared out of the shadows, raised a pistol, and fired twice at Tresca, killing him. The killer was described as 35 years old and 5'5" in height. Two witnesses seen the shooter running into a black Ford. That car was found abandoned blocks away from the crime scene. The police suspected Galante was responsible for the murder and deemed him armed and dangerous. There is a second theory to why Tresca was killed. He once insulted the Bonanno underboss, Francesco Garofalo, by publicly calling him a gangster, which makes sense because at the time, Galante had been inducted into the Bonanno family. When the police did catch up with Galante to question him, he was with Lucchese member Joe Beck di Palermo. It's believed di Palermo was Galante's getaway driver after the Tresca hit. Ultimately, Galante was arrested, but never charged, and Tresca's murder remained unsolved, even though Galante was the main suspect. Shortly after the murder, Galante received a parole violation, but was back on the street by December 1944. In February 10, 1945, he married Helen Marulli, and Angelo Presenzano was his best man. The marriage produced 3 children, but only lasted 4 years. At the time, they were living at 274 Marcy Avenue in Brooklyn. Galante then began dating Anne Acquavella and fathered 2 more children with her. On September 4, 1947, Galante was arrested after he was spotted placing a still used for manufacturing alcohol into a Cadillac. At the time of his arrest, he told the police that he worked for his brother, who owned a grocery store. On December 16, 1950, Galante was arrested again on the Lower East Side for operating a crap game. During that same year, he would be investigated for the murder of Dominic Idone, who was killed on Mulberry Street. Early on, Galante ventured into the drug business and had connections that reached across the globe, including Canada. And this is most likely why, during the early 50s, Joe Bonanno, the boss of the family, sent him to Canada to set up shop in Montreal. Galante took up residence at 4069 Dorchester Boulevard. While in Canada, he remained in the company of Vincenzo Cotroni, boss of the Cotroni crime family. Galante would set up a heroin pipeline where shipments of heroin was received from Europe and shipped to Montreal, and then trafficked back to the United States. Galante was allegedly moving 50 kilos of heroin a month and obviously didn't personally handle the drugs. In 1954, Galante had Canadian mobsters Luigi Greco and Frank Petrula meet with Lucky Luciano in Sicily. After their meeting, Greco and Petrula returned to Canada with high-grade heroin. Besides drugs, Galante took control of all the bookmakers in Montreal, which reportedly netted the Bonanno family $50 million per year in gambling profits. He even opened a restaurant called The Bonfire and started organizing unions for the hotel, restaurant, and nightclub workers. In essence, Galante planted the Bonanno flag in Canada. There were several murders in Canada that took place while he was there, and he was suspected to be involved in. It's been speculated that throughout Galante's lifetime, he was responsible for or involved in 80 murders. By late 1954, at the request of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Galante would be deported back to the United States. During that time, records indicate that Joe Bonanno placed Galante as part of his administration, which is most likely why he accompanied Bonanno to the famous meeting in October 1957 in Palermo, Sicily, between American and Sicilian Cosa Nostra, where supposedly they collaborated in an international heroin network. That same year, Galante was suspected of joining Joe Bonanno at the infamous Appalachian meeting. 1 year prior to that meeting, Galante was arrested on October 17, 1956, for speeding in Binghamton. In the car with him was Francesco Garofalo. Apparently, they had just come from visiting Joe Barbera, whose home the Appalachian meeting would be held at. Galante handed the trooper a license belonging to Joe Beck di Palermo. They placed him under arrest for speeding and using someone else's license and being an unlicensed driver. While on the street, Galante was deep in the narcotics business and was known to have black and Spanish drug dealers killed who he considered competition. Galante was a gangster who could quote Plato or St. Augustine off the top of his head, as well as speak several languages, including Italian and Sicilian dialects. By 1957, Galante landed in the top hoodlum program, created by J. Edgar Hoover, which consisted of heavy surveillance on high-ranking mafia members. And as early as 1958, the FBI developed several informants who were providing information on Galante. On June 3rd, 1959, he was arrested on a narcotics conspiracy and was actually indicted 2 times for narcotics. His first trial ended in a mistrial in 1960, but he would be convicted in a second trial in 1962 and sentenced to 20 years. It's been reported while serving time at Atlanta Federal Prison, Galante continued to get into trouble. He would start fights and was famous for pitting inmates against one another. Nevertheless, even in a prison as tough as Atlanta, his reputation preceded him. By the time of his release, Joe Bonanno had unwillingly retired, and Philip Rusty Rastelli was the new boss. While back on the street, Galante did what he did best, deal narcotics. He supposedly made millions and was very greedy and unwilling to spread the love among his fellow members of the mafia. For those of you who like to donate to this channel, I'll mention the Super Thanks icon found beneath this video, and I thank you. There's even unconfirmed reports that Galante eliminated several people affiliated to the Gambino family regarding the drug business. In 1975, Rastelli was indicted for racketeering, and on April 23, 1976, he was convicted and sentenced to 10 years. With Rastelli no longer in the picture, Galante made a power move and basically declared himself the boss of the family. His ego got the best of him, and he created a long list of enemies. Most likely the reason why he created a Sicilian army within the Bonanno family that he used as bodyguards. One of Galante's famous quotes was that no one will ever kill me, they wouldn't dare. Not only did they dare, but they succeeded in killing him on July 12, 1979.